COD history, there's been a lot of DLC content, whether that be just simply map packs or DLC weapons added in post-launch, like the Peacekeeper from Black Ops 2, kicking off that entire whirlwind of what we'd end up seeing today as being a part of a regular update for content. No matter what way you spin it, there has been a lot of DLC content throughout the franchise post-launch and even further outside of even just the initial support of the first year, like we've seen many of the recent titles in the franchise have, extending into a second year here and there with some content dripped in for players still on the title. But while we have seen a lot of it, there's also been some really crazy DLC items added into the game. So today, let's take a look at 8 of the most ridiculous DLC items in COD history. Let's start out with one of my favorite here, because this was from the map Ruins from Call of Duty Ghosts. Ghost was a hit or miss title depending on who you ask, but it definitely had some really cool things in terms of camos and especially some pop culture features, which we ended up seeing in the way of the map Ruins. The field order actually granted you the ability to become the Predator. That's right, the classic movie Predator was available in-game as a playable item. You ended up having the ability to see heat vision, you ended up having just a melee weapon, so it was very similar to a reskin of the Maniac from that game. But the interesting part is that if you ended up getting it, you were pretty much feared throughout the entire map. It was a small close quarters map, so you could definitely do some damage, but the interesting characteristic about it was that afterwards, if you ended up getting killed, you would go into a final stand sort of scenario and it would call in a chem strike. So you're guaranteed at least however many players were alive on the playing field at that point, that number of kills, even if you didn't get any of the melees that extended outwards. The same thing went for also, there was a Michael Myers variant of a field order as well, for I believe it was DLC 1 or DLC 2, can't remember off the top of my head which order it was entirely, but still, the fact remained that pop culture bled over into Call of Duty Ghosts, where we got not only the Predator, but also Michael Myers as field order sort of reskins for the Maniac. Definitely a very cool DLC item, and one that was definitely out there, especially at the time, and looking back, still not many have topped that. Number 2 up on this list, we're going to jump over to a couple of melee weapons throughout this video, one of which we're going to talk about right now, that being the tribal melee weapon from Modern Warfare Remastered. Now, Modern Warfare Remastered introduced supply drops and DLC content to Modern Warfare, whereas some people may not have been too keen on it to get new items and things that weren't in the original added in on top of that, but it ended up happening. And as that, we ended up seeing a ton of different DLC melee weapons added in, but there are a couple in particular that stood out, the tribal being one of them, in which if you completed the collection for it, you ended up getting the bounty reward of that melee, in which it's comparable to that cow or buffalo skull head with the horns on top of it, mounted on what seems like another bone, and you'd go around the map just whacking people to death with it. And of course, while there are so many different other viable options, such as, say, a karambit knife, a sword even, can't say you really expected to really ever be knocked out by a skull mounted on another bone. So certainly an interesting one, and kind of out there, again, a little absurd, a little crazy, but that's kind of the focus here of this video to begin with. Number 3 sees us jumping back to Ghosts, but also slightly in counterpart tandem with Infinite Warfare, that being to the weapon, the Venom X. Now, for those of you guys that played Extinction, you knew exactly what this was. It was there from that mode, but it eventually made its way over into multiplayer with the map Unearthed. There was a little bit of an Easter egg you could do whenever you wanted to go and get this in an actual game, and one person per match could actually get this and use it. You, I think, had 10 shots or so once you did do it, but you had to essentially release it from a crane in which it was dangling above the rest of the map. You could do this with explosives by blowing up the cabling, and it would eventually drop down for the player to get. Now, this, again, gave you 10 shots of an explosive acid type of ammo, and so you had yourself a little bit of a wonder weapon launcher within regular MP. And while it was a zany crossover that would only happen really, say, once every match or so, with very limited amounts of ammo on it, very similar to how a field order would be a limited time event within game, it was something that kind of leveled that and gave it its own little unique attributes to the map Unearthed. I can't say it was the best weapon out there, but it was certainly something fun to take advantage of back in the day. Outside of that, let's jump up to a more recent time, that being World War II. Call of Duty World War II was very restricted in what it could do based off of a lot of the community wanting historical accuracy. So while there were a ton of different weapons that were makeshift or prototype weapons for World War II, a lot of the content post-launch stuck to weapons that were visibly known and were really classic weapons of World War II. Except until whenever we got to DLC 4 for World War II, in which we ended up having an entire sort of DLC content pack related around the Reich and their use of experimental technology. So we, of course, course, had weapons in terms of the event that went on of Covert Storm that had cool variants, say, dealing with atoms and atomic bombs, plus also that variant for the Proto X1, which was really cool and reminded everybody of Dark Matter. But in Operation Arcane, the final war map of the content season, we ended up seeing super serums added into World War II, in which you had 3 different serums you could get at random. It wasn't something that you got to really choose. You ended up having the ability to become a maniac, you could end up having combat awareness, or you could get a combat buff, to which each offered their own unique abilities. Maniac gave you increased health, but you only had a sword available. Your awareness allowed you to see the outlines of players through walls and have that heightened ability to know where enemies are. And then combat buff allowed you to pretty much have that specialist perk ability where you'd have a large number of perks all into one, which made up for it, of course, because specialist was in place of score streaks and you couldn't use score streaks in war, so it kind of was a balancing act that you could end up getting it for a very limited time. So these were all added in, and of course were definitely zany and played into the experimental tech factor of Operation Arcane and DLC 4, but definitely was a little bit out there. I can't tell you the last time that I remember injecting a soldier with a super serum in Call of Duty, but we saw it in World War II. Next thing up on deck was that of flashing back a little bit to Infinite Warfare, one that actually was broken initially on launch, but the Proteus Sniper / Shotgun Hybrid DLC weapon is the next one up here that we're going to discuss. Now, this one was classified as a sniper, and it certainly was much better as a sniper, but it was something that if you held triangle or Y, depending on the console you were on, or whatever you had your toggle bound to on PC, you could end up swapping from either sniper or shotgun mode, depending on what sort of engagement it called for. Whenever you had somebody at long range, you could snipe them, and then if somebody was pushing you close range right after that, you could immediately swap to go to a shotgun and pull off a nifty double kill instead of having to rely on the chance you might not hit that quick scope. So it was definitely something that was out there. Wasn't the first prototype weapon that we've seen. We saw something similar of a rifle and sniper back in Ghost. We saw that the Peacekeeper had all the attributes of 2 different weapon classifications as well back in Black Ops 2. So by no means is the hybrid aspect of a DLC weapon something brand new, but it was certainly something interesting that, especially given the launch, where it was so broken, a sniper and a shotgun combo was released as such. Next up on this list, we're going to flash back for the next 2 classifications, actually, back to Black Ops 3. The first one we'll talk about is the L4 Siege, a rocket launcher that has the potential for 4 rockets, not at once, but consecutively, in which you could have 4 rockets chambered and 4 in reserve at the max if you had Scavenger, but it was certainly something if you direct impacted them, you could get some decent amounts of kills off with it, but it certainly was tough if you did not. Usually it was about 2 to 3 rockets that would end up killing the player unless it was a direct hit, but it was the first time in COD history that we had seen a weapon very similar to this, and being the build of it as well was certainly something interesting if you were to take a look and compare it to any other rocket launcher we'd seen in the franchise up until then. The L4 Siege was certainly an interesting design aspect. Still have a little bit of a grudge about it that I ended up using one of my bribes for a ranged weapon, and I ended up getting the L4 Siege, but you know what? I think we'll let it slide. Number 7 up on this list is one that we're actually going to split because they were released at the same time and they're both really interesting in their own right, that being the DIY Renovator and also D13 Sector. Both of these are ballistic weapons. They're not the only ballistic weapons within Black Ops 3, but they're not traditional hit scan weapons that you'd normally see throughout the game. So that means that you have to account for lead time, even though there's very minimal, you have to account for that, and that travel time is the biggest factor. You won't necessarily be aimed in on where somebody is running across on them and get a kill with the DIY Renovator, an SMG that shoots nails. And the D13 Sector bounces off every single wall, but unless they're right in front of that, again, same scenario. If they're running or moving at all, you're gonna have to lead them so they run into it. It's not something that is a point and shoot that does exact damage like all the other weapons within Black Ops 3 would be, outside of, say, the Banshee, the Rift E9, and these ones, I believe. But these ones were definitely crazier in their own right because, I mean, one shot nails, one shot a buzzsaw, quite literally, and it was our first real entrance into some zany content coming throughout Black Ops 3. There was definitely some experimental weaponry going on here with this that, if you put it in absolutely any other title, probably wouldn't have worked out too well in the franchise, but because it was Black Ops 3, it was definitely something that was still fun to play around with, even though it was slightly out there. And the final thing we'll talk about in terms of out there weaponry is another melee weapon from Modern Warfare Remastered. Again, we talked about there was a decent number of them in their own collections that added into the content at hand on top of the base Modern Warfare, but the Danger Close melee weapon was one that always made me laugh, because we ended up taking melee weapons and then skinning it to the point where we had a dud of an RPG rocket and use that as a melee weapon. So instead of it blowing a player up, you just knocked him over the head with it. This big, dense rocket that wouldn't explode still somehow got the job done as a melee weapon. As with all the other DLC weapons within Modern Warfare Remastered, it was completely optional. You could end up unlocking it via collections, and so therefore it was really up to you if you wanted to get it or not. But still definitely one that I think is a funny one to close out this list. That's where we're gonna wrap it up, so let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you guys think I missed any here that you would add to this list? Anything you'd take away? Whatever it may be, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, but wanted to kind of do a fun retrospective look at some of the craziest DLC items that we've seen in the Call of Duty franchise up until today. So that said, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, but hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to drop a like down below, and of course, if you are new to the channel, make sure you guys subscribe so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Call of Duty, Black Ops 4 right now, and maybe even Modern Warfare 4, if that so turns out to be the title later on down the line. Any updates, news, information, tips, tricks, all that good stuff, we got you covered. So if any of that interests you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing. And if you guys also want to follow me over on Twitter and Instagram, there's the best place to get connected outside of YouTube. I can live on both those, so if you guys want to strike up a conversation, ask me a question, whatever it may be, that link is down there in the description below. Well, said and out of the way, thank you guys all so much for watching. Mine has been Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care, and peace.